Let me tell you something that will feel wrong the moment you hear it. The person who made you rich was never your friend. It was the one who doubted you, the one who laughed, the one who said quietly or loudly, "You're not built for that." That person did more for your future than every Mendy you ever paid for, every book you ever finished, every seminar you ever sat through with a notebook open and good intentions burning in your chest. You've been taught the opposite your whole life. Surround yourself with people who believe in you. Find your tribe. Build a support system. Cut out negative energy. And none of that is false, but it is dangerously incomplete. Because belief without friction produces comfort, not power. And comfort has never built an empire. Not one. Not ever. Show me a man who rose to real wealth surrounded only by agreement, and I will show you a man who is lying about how he actually rose. Machiavelli did not write The Prince as a guide for men who wanted to be liked. He wrote it as a manual for men who want to survive in a world that does not care whether you are liked. He understood something most people spend their entire lives avoiding. Something sound comfortable, that entire industries of soft motivational content exist purely to help people avoid looking at it directly. Opposition is not the obstacle to power. Opposition is the material power is made from. Take away the resistance, and you take away the forge. What remains is a man with intentions and no proof. So here is the brutal truth we are going to sit with today, slowly, without flinching. Your enemies are not a problem to be solved. They are a resource to be used, refined, and eventually released once they've done their job. And if you do not know how to use them, you will spend your life running from the exact force that was meant to build you, mistaking every insult for an injury instead of recognizing it for what it actually is, raw material. Let's start with what actually happens inside a man when someone doubts him, because most people never examine this moment closely enough to understand its architecture. There's a moment, cold and specific, when someone you respected looks at your plan and says nothing, or worse, says good luck with that in a tone that means the opposite. Maybe it happens at a family dinner. Maybe it happens in a hallway after a meeting, quietly, so no one else hears it. Maybe it comes from someone whose opinion never should have mattered this much, and yet somehow it does. Most men absorb that moment as an injury. They carry it home. They replay it on the drive back, in the shower, at 2 a.m. when the house is silent, and their thoughts get loud. They let it prove something about themselves that was never actually proven at all. But a small number of men do something else entirely. They take that exact moment and convert it into fuel. Not motivation, that's too soft a word, too easily forgotten by. Wednesday, fuel, something that burns and does not run out until the thing is finished. Something that doesn't care whether you feel like getting up at 5 a.m. because it isn't asking your permission. This is not a personality trait some people are born with, and others simply lack. That is the lie the comfortable tell themselves to explain why they never tried. It is a mechanism, and mechanisms, unlike personalities, can be built, studied, and repeated on command. Think about every founder, every builder, every person who created something in the world. Eventually had to respect whether it wanted to or not. Almost none of them tell a story that starts with everyone cheering. The story always starts the same way. Someone said it wouldn't work. A parent, a partner, an old boss, an old friend, sometimes a stranger who simply happened to be standing in the wrong place at the wrong moment with the wrong opinion, and that rejection became the seed. Not because rejection is magic, because rejection is specific. It gives you a target, a face, a name, a sentence you can replay at 5 a.m. when no one else is awake, and your motivation, the soft kind, has already left the building days ago. Belief doesn't do that. Belief is warm and forgettable, like a compliment you receive and lose. Within the hour, doubt is sharp and it stays embedded somewhere you cannot quite reach. With logic alone, which is exactly why it is so useful. Machiavelli understood something that modern self-help conveniently leaves out of every glossy paperback with a sunrise on the cover. He said a wise prince should find ways to give rise to enmities, so that in overcoming them, his greatness might rise the higher. Read that, again, slowly, because most people skim past the most important sentence in the entire Philosophy. He is not describing a man who avoids enemies out of fear or discomfort. He is describing a man who actively uses them as scaffolding, who understands that a structure needs opposing forces pressing against it in order to stand at all. This is where most people misunderstand power completely, and this misunderstanding is precisely why so many stay exactly where they started for decades. They think power is the absence of resistance. It is not. Power is resistance, transformed, redirected, put to work. A. Muscle does not grow from comfort. It grows from tearing under load and rebuilding. Stronger than it was before the tear ever happened. Your ambition works the same. Biological way, whether you like the metaphor or not. Without resistance, it stays soft, untested, theoretical, a plan that exists only in conversation. With resistance, it either breaks entirely or becomes something that cannot be talked out of existence by the next person who doubts it because it has already survived doubt once and knows what that survival costs. So the question you should be asking is never, how do I avoid people who don't believe in me? That question keeps you small and keeps you comfortable, which are often the same thing wearing different clothes. The real question is, how do I convert their doubt into architecture? Because doubt, once converted, does not disappear. It becomes load-bearing. Let's get into mechanics now, because theory without mechanics is just another form of entertainment. Here is how the ones who actually rise use the enemy advantage, step by step, without romance, without excuses, and without the comfortable lie that everyone who ever doubted you was simply wrong about everything forever. Lesson 1. Name the doubt specifically. Vague resentment does nothing productive. It just sits in the body like low-grade static, draining energy without ever pointing it anywhere useful. People don't believe in me. It's too broad to burn cleanly. It has no edges, no shape, nothing for mine to grip onto during the hard hours. But my brother said I'd be broke by 30. That is specific. That has a date attached, a face attached, a room it was set in. Specificity is what turns an emotional wound into a functional weapon rather than a background hum of self-pity. Machiavelli never spoke in vague terms about his rivals in his private correspondence. He studied them individually, understood their exact position, their exact weakness, their exact motive, the precise contours of what they wanted and feared. You must do the same with your own doubters, not to attack them personally. That would be small and would waste the very energy you're trying to harness. You use the precision of their doubt as the precision of your target. Write the sentence down exactly as it was said. Don't soften it. Don't paraphrase I tinto something more comfortable. The version that stings the most is the version that will actually move you. Lesson 2. Do not seek their approval later. This is where almost everyone fails, and it fails quietly, which makes it more dangerous than an obvious mistake. They succeed, and then, without realizing what they're doing, they wait for the doubter to acknowledge it. They post a win where that person will see it. They mention the achievement casually at dinner, hoping for a flicker of respect in the eyes that once dismissed them. This destroys the entire mechanism from the inside out. The moment you seek their approval, you hand the power back to them without a fight, without even noticing the handoff happened. The relationship reverses completely. You become the one performing for validation. Exactly the trap you were trying to escape in the first place, just wearing a nicer suit this time. The wealthy do not seek closure from their doubters. They let the silence between them become permanent, unresolved, and entirely fine with staying that way. Silence is a form of victory that requires no announcement, no witnesses, no applause. It simply is, and it does not need anyone else's confirmation to be real. Lesson 3. Choose enemies with precision, not emotion. Not every person who doubts you deserves the fuel seat in your mind. A stranger's passing comment on the internet is noise, forgettable within the hour, unworthy of a second thought. But the doubt of someone whose judgment you once respected, a father, an old mentor, a former boss, that doubt carries weight because part of you still, secretly, wonders if they were right. That is exactly the doubt worth using. The ones that sting the most are the ones with the most leverage over your psychology, and leverage, once identified, can be redirected. Machiavelli would tell you to study your enemy's position before reacting to their words, to understand exactly why they hold the influence they hold over you. Study your own psychology the same clinical way. Find the doubt that actually moves something inside you, that changes your breathing when you recall it, and build your entire strategy around that one specifically. Ignore the rest. They are not worth the fuel. Lesson 4. Let's success stay unspoken. There is a specific kind of power in a man who no longer explains himself to anyone, who has simply stopped performing his own justification. He does not defend his choices at family gatherings. He does not update the group chat with his progress. He does not correct the narrative when people misunderstand his path, even when the misunderstanding is obvious and easy to fix with one sentence. He simply continues and lets the results years later speak in a language louder than any argument ever could. This unbothered quality isn't an indifference, and it is not arrogance either, though it is often mistaken for both by people who have never built anything that required years of invisible effort. It is discipline, because explaining yourself to people who doubted you is still, secretly, asking for their verdict on your life. The man who has truly converted doubt into power no longer needs a verdict from anyone, including the people who once held that verdict over his head like a sentence. Lesson 5. Study the anatomy of every rejection. When someone says no to you, a deal, a loan, a partnership, a job offer, that no contains information, dense and specific, if you're willing to look at it clearly instead of flinching away from the sting, most people feel the rejection and walk away, licking the wound, avoiding the mirror. The strategic mind extracts the mechanism behind the rejection instead. Was it timing? Was it trust? Was it perceived weakness in your pitch, your presence, your position in the room? Machiavelli studied the fall of princes as carefully as their rise, because failure reveals mechanics that success conveniently hides beneath its own confidence. Every rejection you experience is a free lesson in exactly what the world currently believes about you, and beliefs, unlike facts, can be changed through demonstrated results over time. This is not about self-blame. It is about precision. A surgeon does not weep over the wound. He studies it to understand exactly what needs to heal. Lesson 6. Build in the dark, reveal in daylight. The mistake almost everyone makes is announcing the plan before it exists in any real form. They tell the room, they post a vision board, they explain the 5-year plan to people who never asked and never particularly cared. This does 2 damaging things simultaneously. It invites premature doubt before you have built enough armor to absorb it without flinching, and worse, it releases the psychological pressure that would have otherwise fueled the actual work. Talking about a goal creates a small chemical reward in the brain that convinces you the goal is partially achieved simply because you described it out loud to an audience. This is sabotage disguised as excitement, dressed up as momentum when it is actually the opposite. The ones who actually build power say nothing until the thing is undeniable, until the results themselves cannot be argued by even the most committed skeptic. Then they let the result introduce itself, without commentary, without a victory lap, without needing anyone in the room to clap. Lesson 7. Turn the doubter into a debt, not a grudge. Here's the final shift, the one that separates lasting power from bitterness that quietly poisons everything it touches. A grudge consumes you slowly, quietly, for years, with no return on emotional investment whatsoever. A debt is different. A debt is something you fully intend to collect, not through revenge, not through confrontation, but through undeniable proof that simply exists in the world and cannot be argued away. You are not trying to hurt the person who doubted you. You are trying to make their doubt historically, factually, permanently incorrect. This reframe changes everything about how the energy moves through you. Revenge is petty and it burns out fast, leaving nothing behind but exhaustion. But proving someone wrong through relentless, patient construction, that can fuel an entire decade without ever running dry. Machiavelli never wasted energy on cheap retaliation, not because he lacked the capacity for it, but because he understood it was inefficient. He built structures that made retaliation entirely unnecessary. The results did the arguing for him, permanently, without requiring his presence in the room. Now, let me show you what this looks like when it actually plays out in real life, because theory alone convinces no one, and stories are where philosophy actually earns its keep. Picture a young man working under a manager who has decided, for reasons that have nothing to do with talent, that this young man will never be more than what he currently is. Maybe it's jealousy, quiet and unspoken. Maybe it's fear of being outgrown by someone younger, someone hungrier. It doesn't matter what the reason actually is. What matters is a manager says it plainly, in front of others more than once, in that casually cruel way that people who hold small amounts of power often speak to people who don't yet have any. You're not management material. Stay in your lane. Most men in that position spend the next year proving the sentence true without ever realizing they've made that choice. They shrink slightly, almost imperceptibly. They stop praising their hand in meetings. They accept the smaller title because somewhere inside, a part of them quietly agreed with the verdict the moment it was spoken. This is a default outcome. The gravitational pull of doubt left unconverted. And it is why most people never leave the room they started in, not because they lack ability, but because they never challenge the sentence that was handed to them. But every so often, a different kind of man hears that exact sentence, and something else happens entirely. Not an argument in the moment. Arguments in the moment are cheap theater, and they change absolutely nothing about the underlying reality. Something quieter. Something that doesn't need an audience. He writes the sentence down, not to display it anywhere, not to post it for sympathy or encouragement. He simply keeps it, the way a strategist keeps a map of enemy terrain folded carefully in an inside pocket. And then Hester's building in complete silence toward a version of his career that sentence never accounted for and never could have predicted. 2 years later, he is running a division that manager reports into. Nothing dramatic was said. No speech was given at any point. No confrontation was staged for effect. The org chart did the talking, and the org chart is the only argument that never loses, the only verdict that actually matters once enough time has passed. This exact pattern repeats across history, in every field where hierarchy and ambition intersect. The founder who was fired from the company he helped build from nothing, on Lido built something larger and more enduring from the wreckage of that exact rejection. Fletcher Desmond told bluntly that he lacked the polish for a bigger client, who then built a firm serving clients the original doubter could never even access. The pattern is always the same shape, repeating with almost mechanical precision. A specific insult, a silent decade of unglamorous work, an undeniable result, and a doubter who, quietly, without ceremony, without ever being confronted directly, is forced to update their entire understanding off where you actually are. Let me give you a second historical case, because one example alone can feel like an isolated coincidence rather than a pattern, and patterns are what we're actually studying here. Machiavelli watched Cesare Borgia rise through terrain thick with hostility, surrounded one very side by men who underestimated him from the start. Men who assumed his position was simply inherited rather than earned through capability. Men who whispered in candlelit rooms that he lacked the temperament to hold power once he actually had it in his hands. Borgia did not waste his limited energy correcting every whisper that reached him, and there were many. He consolidated territory methodically, town by town. He built loyalty through demonstrated competence rather than through argument or persuasion. And by the time his rivals fully understood what had actually happened to their assumptions about him, the terrain beneath their own feet had already changed ownership entirely, quietly, while they were still busy underestimating him in rooms he no longer needed access to. This is the pattern you are meant to notice above all else, not the drama of the conflict itself, which is what most retellings focus on, because drama sells better than discipline. The rise never actually happens in the argument, in the confrontation, in the dramatic momental vindication that movies love to show. It happens in the years no one was watching closely enough to see it coming, in the unglamorous accumulation of small, correct decisions made consistently, while the doubters had already moved on to doubting someone else entirely. There's a third example we're sitting with, one closer to our own era, because it proves this principle did not end with the Renaissance and does not require velvet robes or marble chessboard function. Consider a man building a company that investors repeatedly decline to fund, sometimes politely, sometimes with barely concealed condescension about his age or his background or his lack of a certain pedigree. Each rejection contained the same underlying message dressed in different professional language. You are not what we're looking for. Most founders in that position eventually internalize the message and quietly close the laptop for good, telling themselves a comfortable story about timing or luck rather than confronting what actually happened. But a specific type of founder takes each rejection letter, each dismissive meeting, and files it away with the same precision as a sealed letter in Ask Strategist's private correspondence. Years later, when the company succeeds beyond what anyone in those rooms predicted, he does not send a single email reminding them of their mistake. He does not need to. The valuation does a reminding for him, silently, permanently, in a language that requires no follow-up. There is one more mechanism worth understanding before we move to the warning, because without it, everything we've discussed so far can quietly collapse into wishful thinking dressed up as strategy. Call it the compounding ledger. Most men who attempt to use doubt as fuel fail, not because the psychology is wrong, but because they have no system for tracking whether the fuel is actually converting into anything measurable. They feel motivated for a season. They work hard for a few months. And then, without any external event forcing the change, the fire quietly dims and they drift back toward whatever comfortable pattern existed before the doubt ever entered the picture. This is not a failure of willpower. It is a failure off measurement. The wealthy men who actually complete this process keep something resembling a private ledger, whether on paper or simply in the architecture of their own memory, not a diary of feelings, which tend to dissolve into vague self-pity or vague self-congratulation depending on the day. A ledger of specific evidence. Every month, they ask themselves one clarifying question. What did I build this month that the doubter's sentence did not account for? Not what did I feel, not what did I intend. What did I actually build in a form that could be pointed to, measured, verified by someone outside my own head? This single habit changes the entire trajectory of the process because it converts an emotional grievance into a running tally, and running tallies compound in a way that raw emotion never can. A man who is simply angry at his old manager stays angry indefinitely, without direction. A man who is tracking 12 consecutive months of measurable progress against that manager's exact prediction is no longer angry in the same way at all. He is simply accumulating proof, month after month, the way a merchant accumulates inventory methodically, without needing to feel a particular way about any single entry. Machiavelli understood this instinctively in his own writing. Even though the language oath ledgers and metrics did not exist in his time the way it exists now, he advised princes to keep precise records of alliances, betrayals, debts owed and debts collected, not out of bureaucratic obsession, but because precision is what separates a strategist from a man, merely reacting to his emotions in the moment. A prince who could recall exactly which nobleman had slighted him 3 years earlier, and exactly what had been built since that slight occurred, held an advantage that a prince operating purely on vague resentment could never match. Apply the same discipline to your own life, and something specific happens within the first year. The sentence that once controlled your mood begins to lose its grip, not because you're forgiven it, and forgiveness was never actually the goal here, but because you have simply outgrown its relevance through accumulated evidence. The doubter's sentence was frozen in a single moment of time. Your ledger keeps moving forward. Eventually, the gap between the frozen sentence and the moving ledger becomes so large that the sentence itself starts to feel almost quaint, almost irrelevant, like an old newspaper headline about a storm that has long since passed. This is also where most men need to hear an uncomfortable clarification, because the compounding ledger can be misused just as easily as the emotional fuel can be misused. The ledger is not for public display. The moment you start showing your monthly progress to the doubter directly, even subtly, even through a mutual friend, even through a strategically placed social media post, you're converted a private strategic tool into a public performance, and public performance reintroduces the exact dependency on their approval of that lesson two warned you against from the very beginning. Keep the ledger for yourself and for no one else. Its entire power comes from the fact that no one is watching you keep it. Now here's the part almost no one talks about. The part that determines whether any of this actually works long-term or simply becomes another form of self-destruction wearing a strategic costume. Using your enemies as fuel is dangerous if you never learn to put the fire down at the appropriate moment. Some men never move past this stage, and this is where the mechanism, left unchecked, becomes a trap disguised as a strategy. They build an entire empire out of spite, brick by brick, and even when they finally win, decisively and unambiguously, they cannot stop fighting ghosts that have long since lost interest in the war. The doubter moved on years ago, forgot to comment entirely. In fact, the way people forget most things they say carelessly in passing. built their own small, unremarkable life somewhere far away from a battlefield that still occupies your mind every single night. And you are still up at 2 a.m. fighting a war only one person is still attending, alone, in a room no one else even remembers exists. This is a trap hidden inside the tool itself. Fuel that never converts into permanent structure, just burns you alive slower than it burns your original enemy. And the tragedy is that you often don't notice the difference until years have quietly disappeared. The goal was never to stay angry forever, no matter how productive that anger once felt in the early years. The goal was to use the anger long enough, and only long enough, to build something that outlasts the need for anger entirely. Something that stands on its own once the emotional scaffolding is finally removed. Machiavelli's princes did not rule through permanent, endless warfare. Contrary to how popular culture often flattens its philosophy into simple ruthlessness, they used conflict strategically, with clear intention and clear limits, then consolidated their gains, then governed from a position where conflict was no longer necessary, because the outcome was no longer seriously in question by anyone paying attention. That is the final level of enemy advantage. The level almost nobody discusses because it requires admitting that anger, however useful, has an expiration date, not eternal resentment carried like a stone in the chest. Strategic use of resentment, applied with precision, followed by its complete and total release the moment the structure helped build no longer needs it to stand. So here's where I leave you, at the end of everything we've walked through together. Stop trying to surround yourself only with people who believe in you. That instinct feels safe, and it will keep you comfortable indefinitely. And comfortable men do not build things that outlast a single decade, let alone a lifetime. Instead, learn to extract the exact mechanism from every doubt you've ever received, going all the way back if you need to. Study the way a strategist studies an opposing army's formation, coldly, without flinching, without the need to feel better about it in the moment. Find its precision, use its weight. Build in silence for as long as silence is required. Let the results argue for you when the time finally comes. Because arguments in the moment never convinced anyone who was entirely looking for a reason to believe you in the first place. And when the structure is finally built, when the proof is undeniable to even the most stubborn skeptic, when the people who doubted you are forced quietly in private to consider what they once said about you out loud, do not celebrate, do not gloat, say nothing at all, because the man who no longer needs anyone to acknowledge his rise has already won something more valuable than any apology could ever give him. He has become someone their doubt can no longer reach. One last thing, before you close this and go back to your day like nothing happened here. Somewhere in your life right now, there is a sentence. Maybe it was said last week. Maybe it was said a decade ago and it never actually left, still sitting somewhere in the back of your mind like an unpaid bill. Someone told you what you could not become. A parent measuring you against a sibling who chose an easier, more approved path. A partner who left because they didn't believe the vision was real or worth the wait. A boss who passed you over because, in his mind, you had already been sorted into a category you would never escape. A box with your name on it that he never expected you to leave. You have two paths from here, and only two, no matter how many other options it might feel like you have. You can let that sentence sit in you as an injury, replayed at inconvenient hours. Proof off something you quietly decided is true about your ceiling without ever actually testing it. Most men choose this path without ever realizing they've chosen anything at all. It simply happens to them. The way weather happens to a man without a roof, without shelter, without any protection he built for himself in advance. Or you can do what the ones who actually rise have always done, across centuries, across continents, across every era where ambition met resistance. Pick the sentence up. Study the way a general studies enemy formation, not with anger clouding your vision, but with precision sharpening it. Ask what it reveals about your current position rather than what it claims about your worth. Because those are two very different questions with very different answers. Then close your mouth, open your calendar, and start building the kind of decade that makes the sentence historically false. Not through argument, but through accumulation. No announcement required. No confrontation necessary. No apology ever demanded from anyone. Just results, arriving quietly, one undeniable year at a time, until the only thing left to say is nothing at all. That's silence. The one you never had to explain to anyone, the one that requires no defense and no audience, is the entire point. Before you go, let me leave you with one final distinction, because it separates the men who apply this correctly from the men who twist it into something bitter and ultimately self-defeating. None of what we discuss today is permission to become cruel, to manufacture enemies where none genuinely exist, or to treat every disagreement as an act of war requiring a decade of silent retribution. That would be a shallow reading of everything Machiavelli actually understood about power. The enmities worth using are the ones that arrive on their own unforced, from people whose judgment genuinely mattered to you at some point. Manufacturing artificial conflict for the sake of having someone to prove wrong is simply theater, and theater does not compound the way genuine, earned proof compounds over years of consistent work. There is also a difference worth naming between the doubt that builds you and the doubt that simply damages you, and confusing the two is how some men end up mistaking abuse for motivation. A parent who genuinely wants better for you but expresses it clumsily through skepticism is offering something entirely different from someone who wants to see you fail, because your success threatens their own sense of position in the world. The mechanism we've walked through today works on the former. It is not a justification for tolerating the latter indefinitely, and Machiavelli himself understood that a prince who cannot distinguish between a useful rival and a genuine threat to his well-being rarely survives long enough to build anything at all. So take the sentence that has been sitting in you, whichever one surfaced while you were listening to this. Study it honestly, the way we've discussed. Ask what it reveals rather than what it claims. And then begin quietly, without announcement, the specific work of making it obsolete through accumulation rather than argument. Not tomorrow, not once conditions improve, not once you feel ready in some abstract emotional sense that may never actually arrive on its own schedule. Now, with whatever resources you currently have in front of you, however limited they may currently seem compared to the scale of what you're eventually building toward. The men who eventually reach the other side of this process rarely describe a single dramatic turning point when they look back on how it happened. They describe years that looked remarkably unremarkable from the outside, one quiet decision compounding into the next, until one day the distance between where they started and where they now stand became too large for anyone, including the original doubter, to argue with in good faith. That is the entire architecture, not a single victory. A long accumulation of small, correct decisions, made in silence, fueled once by doubt and eventually sustained by something far more durable than anger ever was. Begin there. That's all this was ever asking of you.